Hi Dr. Little, this is Josh Junker and this is my screencast for my website, Fix My Home, and it's hosted on Microsoft Azure, so it's at azurewebsites.net. Anyways, if I go to the home screen of my website, it just gives a title, a quick about the page, and that's really the About Us page. And it offers for you to sign in. So I'm going to show you some basic functionality. If I sign in as a regular user, then what shows up first as the default is a list of their auctions that user has made. In this case, I have some API tests that have actually hit the Microsoft server here. But as an example of functionality, I can create a new auction saying Hello World 2. And this is an example. I'll give it a category of hello and that description. And I can create that auction, and it shows up here in their recent auctions. If they want to view past auctions, they have to click View All Auctions, and then they can go and see to page 3 and say I have offers. Oh wow, I haven't even accepted the offer for a really old one, but it's just been testing. So if I see that auction, I can still edit it yet, but it shows that there are no bids there. If it's edited, I'll save it right here. It shows that it's edited. And there aren't any bids for it yet. So over on this side, I'm going to log in as a company. In this case, the name of the company is Company 2. And if I want to, the first thing that shows up is the list of auctions. So if I click View Auctions, it's the same thing. And it shows right here Hello World 2 that we just created with the regular user. And shows the description, the end date, and I can make my bid. Let's say I want to make a bid of $456. I make the bid. So now it shows up in my list here, along with these other two. But these ones are yellow because the bids have been accepted, and because they've been accepted, I can then contact the person and see their info. Or I can view all my past bids, which there are just a couple, but I can go back and contact them if I lost their number or something like that. So back to this one, I can edit my bid if I want, because the bid isn't over and it hasn't been, or the auction isn't over and it hasn't been accepted yet. So let's make it $500. It's done. So we'll come back over here and refresh this screen, and you'll see that instead of saying no bids yet, I have an offer. I'll make another offer with a different company really quick, so you can see the functionality, or see the view, I guess. If you view auctions, this guy's going to bid $650. So he bids that, and over here I refresh, and I get the second offer there. So this guy, let's say he really wants to take just the lowest bid because he thinks both these companies are reputable, so he can accept the offer and it takes him to the company's information if he wants to just call the company right then. And then it shows which bid is accepted after that, and that's what these past ones are. On the company side, right here, Hello World 2, is this, yep, this is the, oh, he's not the one that actually got accepted. So if I refresh this, there aren't any open auctions anymore, and he didn't get that bid, so it doesn't even show up in his list anymore. Now if I sign in as a person who did get the bid, Company 2, Hello World 2 shows up in yellow, indicating that the bid has been accepted. And they can then click Contact and contact the person who accepted their bid so that they can go get the work done. So that's the basic functionality of the site, still in its beginning stages. Now I'll show you the back end. In Visual Studio, I programmed in MVC4 and ASP.NET, and I will start, I'll close all documents, I'll start with my model in the Model View Controller framework. My models are, I list in the entities, and I have, the main ones are auction, bid, and user profile. These other 5 here, 4 or 5, come with the default membership / login framework that I used. I'll give an example of this model, auction, and I use data annotations to note that it's a table, or related to a table in the database called auctions. And for the ID, I annotate it as a hidden input, which means that it shouldn't display here. And for other ones, for example the title, I tell it that it's required, and with this in my content, and my JavaScript files down here in scripts, it has a way to validate it on the front end as well as the back end, making sure that this is required, and also it validates that the max length is 50, so it does some very simple validation just from the model here, as well as I can give it a display name so that when I display it or use a razor expression, which I'll show later in the views, it knows what to display, and I can just edit it in one place and not in all my different views. As you can see, I've done that for most of them here, except for the ones that I don't display, such as the created date and the end date, and the account ID, and then this accepted company ID, which is the company's ID who made the bid that the user accepted. So those are my basic entities, and those relate to my database first through my abstract interfaces here. I'll just go through auctions to make things simple, and you can look through the rest. But if I click on my iAuction repository, which is my interface, it has these methods that anything that implements this interface has to implement all of these methods, such as get user auctions or get the recent user auctions, which is what shows up in the sidebar usually. And the classes that I have implement this are in my concrete folder here, and I'll show the auction repository. It's EF for entity framework because that's how I implemented the backend. Here I create a new EFDB context, which is what the entity framework uses, and if I go into it here, it implements DB context and DB sets. As you can see, the auctions, bids, and user profiles, that's what connects to the database. It's the DB context in the entity framework. If I go back to this auction here, you can see that I've implemented all of those methods, such as getting recent user auctions. I get the oldest date, and currently I just have it set to 3 days late. Is the latest that it'll show an auction in just the sidebar, because that's what I use this get recent auctions for. And so I make sure that it's greater than the oldest date, and I send back the context.auctions.where, and this makes the SQL call to the database just automatically using these link expressions, which is really nice. So that's just a basic example. You can see that I have different things that save and delete auctions and just get auctions or add auctions. And at the end of each one where I add one or modify it, I make sure I do context.save changes, and that saves it to the database. Anyways, the rest you can look at for yourself, but that's the basics of it. Now, I've shown you a lot of that backend area and stuff to do with the model, and I'll go on to controllers before I go into the views. So I'll start with the home controller, because that's the one that a person will hit when they first log in. Well, assuming they don't go to a specific URL, but they'll normally hit the index method first. But first I'll take a note of this data annotation for the class. It's called initialize simple membership, and this is the framework basically that sets up my membership, logging in, logging off, and making sure that I have the current user on and everything like that. And if I go into it, what this does is it makes sure that I set up my database connection down here called EFDB context. That's the name of it, and it makes sure that I have the user profile, user ID, and username, and it creates the tables if I don't even have them. Although not everything is auto-create at this point. So it makes sure that I have all my membership information when somebody actually hits this home controller. So since that's there, when I get into here and it hits the index, I can ask the web security if the user is authenticated. And if they are, then I can ask if they are in a role called company, because I have a roles table in my backend. And if they are in the roles table, then I redirect them to my auction controller and the list with bids action. Or if they're not a company, then I assume they're a regular user and I direct them to the index of the auction controller. Or if they're not any of those, I direct them to a regular view, and I'll go to that because I'll go to the views now. So let's say they haven't logged in or anything like that. Therefore, I direct them to the view, and this is the view that you saw in the very beginning, where it just shows a simple example of the website and how to use it and tells them they can create an account and log in. However, if they're a company, let's go to the auction controller and the list with bids method. So if I can go to the auction controller here, first you realize that it has this authorize data attribute and a company with the initialize membership just in case their URL directed them directly to this, I make sure that the membership is initialized. This authorize attribute is a filter that it's set up with the framework. Obviously, I didn't make all this, but it allows me to make sure that a user is in a certain role and is authenticated within different methods within this controller. So if I go back to my auction controller here, when I go down here to list with bids, which is what we were going to do if they were a company, I make sure they're authorized and I make sure that their role is in a company. Otherwise, it returns an unauthorized message, which normally wouldn't happen unless they're trying to put in a specific URL, an action, and they're not allowed to do so. So it's kind of a way of protecting me, I guess. So those are the data annotations for it. I'll go from the beginning because if they do get redirected to here, then the controller has to be created. And as you can see, I have attributes for this controller of an auction repository, the iBid repository, and the iUser profile repository. And then I also have a page size, which I'll explain later. You already saw the repositories, and so for the constructor, for this controller, it requires all of these as part of the constructor and then assigns them. Now, the unique thing about this that I've implemented in this project is in the infrastructure here, I implemented an inject controller factory which does dependency injection. And so what happens is it creates a kernel and then it adds the bindings for the controllers. And so it says for the kernel, if a controller requires an iAuction repository, then if it's null, if what's the parameter that passed in is null, it will automatically inject an EF auction repository. What that does is it means that I can just have all of my controllers ask for the interfaces, and if ever I need to switch out my backend, my actual repositories, then I can just switch it in one place right here and tell it to use a different backend, and it'll apply to all my controllers, which makes the project very extensible as far as switching out the backend. So I'll go back now to my auction controller and I'll go to that action that we were going to call. If the user was a company, I called the list with bids action here, and it defaults to a page value of 1, but it doesn't have to be that if the user sends in a different page number. Now what I do here is I use my repository to get my open auctions, which I described before in the repositories, and then I get the certain page size using my page size here, and I order it by the end date. And then I create a view model. I have several view models because often I don't want to just show an auction, I want to show an auction with their bids and things like that. So my view models are here and you can look at more, but in this case I'm doing a bids list view model which includes several auction bid view models, and also it includes paging info which is added down here. And so I go through all of the auctions that I got up there and I add all of their bids to it, and this logic here, I'll let you go through that by yourself if you want. And at the end I return this model, my bids list view model, and I'll even show that to you here. If I go to my bids list view model, I here have my auction bid view model, and I enumerable of them, and then my paging info. So I give that to my view, and I'll show you this view. If I go to the view, it's fairly simple here. I've used razor expressions that start with an at, and I ask it if there are more bids. If the auction bids are greater than 0, and if they are, then I go through and I render a partial view called auction bid details. My partial views and my shared views are down here in my views folder, and I do this for each of the auction bids in it. So I can go to auction bid details, there it is, and so for each of those models it gives this the model here, auction bid view model, and I can then use it in my razor expressions down here, and here I do the display name for, and because I have that model.auction.description, it gives it the display name that I gave in my entities in my models there, as I talked about before, and then I have it do the display the information for that description. These are razor calls that make it